I just was trying to keep up with all the numbers, my understanding is 322 and 323 haven't been published or opened.
They were not open.
Yeah, I didn't do all the DNA swab.
So they were impressions, but they.
Yeah.
And so I was just confused because I thought the testimony wasn't that there wasn't any further processing on them, and they weren't. So I was just confused. But as long as they weren't open, nothing was done with them, and I didn't miss something, then that's my only question on that.
If they don't have an A or after it, that means I didn't open it.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
That's mine.
I feel like it's very good and not swabs. That's not our experience.
Make sure I didn't miss a swab. I want to miss a swab.
All right, let's bring jurors, please. Ms. D, cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Agent. Is it Foran or Foran?
Foran.
Foran. I've been worried I was going to say it wrong, even though I've been listening to it. So I have two questions for you to follow up from some of the questions you were answering from Ms. Shikita earlier. You said that the placards in the downstairs, they either had numbers or letters.
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
And the letters generally seem to be associated with footwear impressions?
Yes, ma'am.
And so just sort of to clarify for everybody, O ended up, is O a footwear impression?
No, O is not a footwear impression.
Okay,
Yeah.
so O is the only one of the lettered items that's not a footwear impression.
I believe so. I believe so.
Okay. And you were asked about why some of the latent impressions are collected of sort of unknown materials.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe your answer sort of talked about the fact that early on in a case, you don't know what's going to be found. You don't know what the evidence is going to be moving forward.
That's correct.
And so since you don't know that, you collect anything that might be part of a future latent comparison of some sort.
Yes, ma'am.
And we've heard a lot about latent comparisons of different sorts through the course of this trial. Is a footwear examination a type of latent examination?
Yes.
And would tire tread be a type of latent comparison?
Yes.
And fingerprints are a type of latent comparison?
Yes, ma'am.
And they all, though, involve some sort of forensic testing that involves a comparison.
From what I understand, yes.
Yeah, between sort of a known and an unknown.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the footwear impressions in the downstairs leasing unit, which we've already talked about some. My count, but I might have missed one, was that there were 9 footwear impressions that you identified in the downstairs unit.
I'd have to count. If you want me to,
That sound roughly right?
it's roughly, yes, yeah.
And there was only one that you had any difficulty collecting.
Oh, you mean the one that was on the hardwood?
Correct.
Yes, ma'am.
So you were able to collect photograph and collect all of the footwear impressions that you identified besides one, which was on the hardwood in the foyer.
No, I did not collect all of those that were in carpet.
Okay, so perhaps so all of those placards weren't collected?
Right. Well, with cutting up the carpet.
Right,
it
you would
was-
cut into some of them?
Exactly, yes.
All right. So do you remember how many you actually cut out?
If you give me a second, I can look.
Okay. Seven.
Yes, ma'am.
So that's what so 7 of the carpet impressions were cut out. And you sprayed those with a hardening agent prior to cutting them out.
Yes, ma'am.
And you documented in your report that you had sprayed them with that hardening agent.
Yes, ma'am.
And those impressions were still clearly visible after you had cut them from the carpet.
When I placed them in the box, yes, ma'am.
And there were a large number of boxes available for you to put the carpet in.
Yes, that we tried to make them fit the best we could.
And so you were able to put them in evidence boxes while you were there at the scene in the leasing unit?
Yes, ma'am.
And you also took a large number of pictures of all of those impressions
That's correct.
with all the different lighting.
Yes.
And do you, understanding that you may not know what all of the testing that was done in the future, are you under the impression that people were able to do further testing with the photographs and samples you collected?
Yes, I believe they did.
And the footwear impression, I know you answered this earlier, but there has, some of the witnesses, the orientation is different. If you're facing the units from the parking lot, the footwear impression that you collected that was placard N would be on the left side.
That's correct.
And then there was a fabric impression at location O.
Correct.
May I have just a second, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
Right.
The O was on the right.
Sorry, I meant to say that, and apparently I forgot. So the N was on the left and the O was on the right.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Redirect.
Yes.
All right, thank you, ma'am. You may step down. Further evidence for the state?
State calls Agent DeHaan. Your Honor, for the record, I asked if it would be okay that she be in court during the session, and they were there. She would. You're not.
Thank you.
Do you swear the testimony you give this court should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, ma'am.
Your Honor, while she's sitting there, I asked the lady to remove that board down.
Yes, ma'am. All right, go ahead, Ms. Kidd.
Please state your name.
Mackenzie DeHaan.
How are you employed, ma'am?
I'm currently employed as a forensic scientist supervisor at the North Carolina State Crime Laboratory in the forensic biology section.
First of all, if you could tell us what the North Carolina State Crime Laboratory is.
The North Carolina State Crime Laboratory is an agency that accepts forensic evidence in cases to analyze in different disciplines. I work in the forensic biology section, so I would accept evidence in those types of cases.
And when you say forensic biology, what does that mean for people who might not understand that term?
So forensic biology is using biology and specifically body fluid identification as well as DNA analysis in the criminal justice system. So we receive evidence in criminal cases to analyze for the presence of body fluids or DNA and then make comparisons.
And as a forensic science supervisor, what are some of your duties and responsibilities within that unit?
So in addition to being one of the scientists who performs the analysis, I also supervise other scientists within the unit.
How many folks would you say that you supervise are within the forensic biology unit?
I supervise 7 to 10.
Can you tell us a little bit about how long you've been working at the crime lab?
I've been with the State Crime Lab since 2000.
And over that course since 2000, have you always been in the forensic biology unit?
No, I was in the forensic drug chemistry section for about 2.5, 3 years and then transferred to the biology section.
So for the last 13 years or 13 to 14 years?
Yes, ma'am.
And you said that you were asked to analyze items. How is it that items are sent to the crime lab for analysis?
Law enforcement agencies across the state as well as within the federal jurisdiction will submit evidence to our crime laboratory. They can either do this in person or they can send it through the first-class mail or through a courier service to our laboratories for submission.
And can you tell the jury a little bit about your educational background?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in biology as well as a Bachelor's of Science in chemistry from Stockton College. I then went on to obtain my Master's of Science in microbiology from the University of Tennessee.
After completing your formal education, have you had any education or training in the background of forensic biology?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you tell us generally about how that is?
We have an in-house training program. I am trained in both the body fluid identification unit as well as the DNA analysis unit, so I've undergone training in both of those units. The training consists of both written and practical examinations, working with senior level scientists, working on samples that mimic cases that we would get in as a part of our employment. At the end, we have to take a competency test and pass with 100% accuracy to begin working cases. Additionally, we receive training on an annual basis to further our knowledge in the field. We go to various conferences or have various speakers come to us, it just depends.
And with respect to your 13 or 14 years within the forensic biology unit, could you estimate how many cases you've been asked to work?
Thousands.
And with each particular case, kind of like we've seen here today, does each case have just one item that you're asked, or are you often asked to identify multiple items?
No, they can range from one item up into the hundreds. It just depends on the case.
And you talked about the lab that you work in, the State Crime Lab. Is that an accredited lab?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you asked to compare items in connection with the death of Melissa Huggins-Jones?
Yes, I was.
And in that case, are you prepared to testify as to your findings here in court?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever been asked to testify in court before?
Yes.
Could you estimate how many times?
Over 100 times as an expert in forensic biology.
That was my next question. In this particular case, were you asked to examine multiple items on multiple different occasions?
Yes.
And again, are you prepared to testify as your findings here?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to tender Ms. DeHaan as an expert in the field of forensic biology.
Any objection? Her testimony will be received as proffered.
Ms. DeHaan, can you tell us initially how was a case assigned to you within the SVA, or within the State Crime Lab, excuse me?
Once evidence comes into the laboratory, our evidence control unit assigns it a unique laboratory case number, as well as assigns each item of evidence that comes in with that case to its own item number. The evidence control unit then divides the evidence to which section it needs to go to. So they would put the ones that need to go to latent evidence together, the ones that need to go to biology together. Within my section, we have an evidence technician who assigns the evidence to us when the case comes.
How is there a procedure by which the crime lab will accept items from other agencies? Let me ask it this way. Is there a condition in which the items must be submitted to the state crime lab?
One of the things the evidence control does is make sure that they come in a sealed condition, paper bags, boxes, whatever, to maintain the chain of custody of those items.
If an item is brought to the crime lab for submission to the evidence technician and it's not in a sealed fashion, do you know what happens?
Yes, they remediate the seal, which is they either if it hasn't been submitted yet, they have the agency item, or if it came in like through the seal upon.
Something needs to be remediated in your word or sealed, would the evidence technician make some sort of note of that?
Yes.
Okay. And in this particular case, what were you asked to, just generally speaking, what were you asked to do?
Asked to examine various items for the presence of body fluids, and then to, if possible, to develop DNA profiles from any items.
We've talked a lot about, over the last several days, that there were two sections that the Raleigh Police Department was working, separate Raleigh Police Department case of that as well.
Evidence was submitted under 2 case numbers, so when it was brought into the laboratory, it was given 2 lab case numbers. So I had 2 separate cases myself.
And just for purposes of kind of for the jury to understand, some of the detectives have classified the upstairs unit as a homicide and the downstairs unit as a burglary. To you, or is there a distinction in which you made?
The burglary, and one is listed as a homicide.
And so with respect to the information that you were asked to do, were they submitted under two different, the homicide and the burglary?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when the Raleigh Police Department had 2 different case numbers for the upstairs and the downstairs, does the SBI then to a separate case number?
Yes, because they came in, so they would get their own laboratory case number.
And just to further confuse the jury, so now I have 2 Raleigh Police numbers, 2 CCBI numbers, and 2 SBI numbers.
Yes.
Okay. When you were asked to first examine for bodily fluids, what kinds of bodily fluids can the SBI and can you test for, the crime lab test for?
At the crime lab, we can test for blood, semen, and saliva. Those are the body fluids we have screening or confirmatory tests for.
And with any piece of evidence that's brought in for to determine whether you can do DNA analysis, do you first need to determine whether you have a bodily fluid?
It depends on the type of evidence and what type of testing is asked for. There are certain items that are brought in that, such as contact or touch DNA, where there is no screening test. So those items would not go through a body fluid screening because there's none to be done.
And they wouldn't have a screening test, and what you mean by a screening test?
The screening tests are a chemical indication test to tell us that that body fluid is there. That we have screening tests for blood, we have screening tests for semen, and we have screening tests for saliva. We can run a chemical test which shows a color change to us that gives us an indication that that body fluid may be present. For touch DNA, you're looking for skin cells being left behind. We don't have a screening test for that.
And with respect to the processing that you did in either of the case numbers, were you asked to look for the presence of bodily fluid?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you asked to do some additional testing in some of the matters in which you did find bodily fluids?
Yes, I also performed DNA analysis.
Can you generally tell us first how you screen for bodily fluids, or whether it's different depending on what you're looking for?
It's different depending on which body fluid I'm looking for.
Okay. And then generally speaking, can you explain the process by which you do a DNA analysis?
Sure. DNA is a multi-step process. The first thing we do is extract the DNA from the cell. So we have to get the DNA out of the cellular material that we're looking at. It's kind of like cracking open an egg to get the yolk out of it. Once we get the DNA out, We then have to know about how much DNA do we have to start with? What kind of sample are we dealing with? We then make many, many copies of the DNA that we got in order to visualize it. And the many copies we're making are not all the DNA that's there. Your DNA that you have in your body is primarily the same as the person sitting next to you. It's what makes us human. It's what gives us 2 eyes and 2 arms. It's what allows our bodies to function. Those aren't the areas we're interested in. We're looking at areas that make you unique from another person. So we only make copies of the areas that we're looking at, not the entire DNA that we have. Once we make these copies, we then separate them so that we can visualize them, and then we do a comparison. And we compare the unknown samples that were obtained from the crime scene back to known samples that were collected from known individuals in the case to see if there are any matches or non-matches between the 2 types of samples.
The process that you described prior to the comparing, that is sort of figuring out what you have and then replicating it, does that change the structure or the characteristic of the DNA in any way?
No, it's basically like a Xerox machine. We're making exact copies of what we started with. We just need enough copies so that we can visualize it.
And the process that you described here in court, generally, again speaking, is that a process that is unique to the North Carolina Crime Lab, or is that something that is accepted in the field nationally and or internationally?
It's used throughout the nation as well as throughout the world.
And in terms of this particular case, you said you had several submissions under several case numbers. Initially speaking, do you recall meeting with a particular detective in this case to figure out what should be done?
There were phone calls that said they were submitting items of evidence in the case, but I don't specifically remember.
And I think probably to make it easiest, if we can separate sort of the downstairs and the upstairs, did you create reports and opinions in each of those particular units?
Yes.
Focusing initially on the downstairs, or the leasing office as we've been calling it, what was your case number in that regard?
Is that the homicide or the burglary?
The burglary, I'm sorry.
That is R 2013-07739.
And in that particular case, and I'll refer to it as the burglary to make it simpler, when were you first requested to examine some items?
The evidence was submitted on May 15th of 2013.
And in this particular case, or when a case comes to the crime lab, are there certain time frames in which you typically are able to turn around evidence, and then others that you would expedite?
We have a rush case policy. When evidence is submitted, we start at the beginning of each year with case number 1 and work until the end of that year with whatever numerical number of cases that have been submitted. That's the way we work the cases. If it was submitted in January, it would get worked before a case that was submitted in February. We do have a policy for rush case submission, which is if additional information is gathered, approval can be made to pull a case out of that order to work it more quickly.
And what items were submitted initially in the burglary case?
The first items that were submitted were 2 swabbings from an interior windowsill, 2 swabbings from an exterior patio rail.
And when you're asked to examine certain items, did you have any known standards submitted, that is, a known person of interest submitted at that point to examine them against?
At that point, the known standard I had for comparison was the blood stain from Miss Jones.
And how was it that you came into possession of a blood stain from Miss Jones?
The blood stain was submitted as a part of the sexual assault evidence collection kit that was collected by the medical examiner.
May I approach the witness, Judge?
Yes.
I'm going to show you first what's been introduced into evidence as State's Exhibits 31, 32, 33, and 34 and ask if you recognize those.
Yes.
And how do you recognize those?
State's Exhibits 31, 32, 33, and 34 all bear a unique laboratory number that's assigned to it, as well as the item number, my initials, and date. We put barcodes on as a part of our tracking system, and those are on each of the envelopes.
And can you recognize these with the case number that you previously said was related to the burglary?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 30 and ask if you recognize that.
Yes.
And what is State's Exhibit 30?
State's Exhibit 30 is the sexual assault evidence collection kit that was submitted under the other case for analysis.
And so that would be, just to make it simpler, the homicide case?
Yes, ma'am.
And in the past, have you had occasion to be presented with one of those sexual assault evidence collection kits?
Yes.
And you said that there's a blood stain contained within that particular kit?
When it's submitted to the lab, yes, ma'am.
And do you know who collected that kit? Is that information that you were given?
Yes, that was collected at the medical examiner's office. I'm not sure if I have the doctor who did it, but yes.
And once you received those particular items, that is the 4 potential blood swabbings and got the blood stain from Melissa Huggins-Jones, what did you do in connection with this particular submission?
The State's Exhibits 31, 32, and 33, which are the 4 swabbings, those were examined first for blood, and then a cutting was taken from each of those 4 for DNA analysis.
And when you said that they were examined for blood, what do you do to do that?
I performed a screening test on them to see if there were any indications for the presence of blood on any of those items.
Can you explain that screening test?
Yes, the screening test that we do, the first thing that we do is we visually examine the swab. We then use a small piece of filter paper, and I would rub the swab onto it to try and transfer any of the material from the swab to the filter paper. I then add a series of 3 chemicals that are colorless to that filter paper and look for a color change. If the color change is from clear to pink, that's a positive reaction.
With respect to the swabbings from the interior windowsill or the patio rails, which, if any of those, gave the chemical indications for the presence of blood?
All 4 of those swabbings gave the chemical indications for the presence of blood.
And once you have those chemical indications for blood, what, if anything, do you do next?
In this case, I took a small cutting from each, placed them in separate tubes, and performed the DNA process to develop a genetic profile from each of the swabs.
And were you able to develop a genetic profile from each one of those 4?
Yes.
You had said that you also had the blood stain from Melissa Huggins-Jones. Do you have to do anything with that particular blood stain?
The blood stain was also put through the DNA process to obtain a profile. That was done in conjunction with evidence in the homicide case. Once I develop the profile, I can use that for comparison in any future submission. So the information I obtained during the homicide was used to do the comparison in this burglary.
And so that is, just to be clear, once you have done the process that you said about extracting it, looking at it, and that sort of thing, can you use the profile that you have developed for each of the submissions you were requested to?
Yes.
As you don't have to do it again.
Correct.
Were you then comparing the Melissa's DNA with the profile that you developed from State's Exhibits 32 through, I guess, no, 30, may approach, so do not misnumber anything else today. Were you able to then compare it to State's Exhibits 31 through 34?
Yeah, after I developed a DNA profile from the blood stain from Miss Jones, I compared that DNA profile to the DNA profiles obtained from State's Exhibits 31 through 34.
And as an expert in the field of forensic biology, what was your determination?
The DNA profile that was obtained from the swabbings from the interior windowsill, as well as the swabbings from the exterior patio rail, was obtained, and it matches the DNA profile obtained from the bloodstain from Miss Jones.
And to be clear, the SBI gives a unique number for each particular case, is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, so that is, you submit items, they get numbers within the lab, is that correct?
Yes.
And looking up there at States Exhibits 31 through 34, if you could, do they have an agent's case name from the CCBI associated with them?
Yes, they do.
And what is that agent's name?
Agent Fran.
Okay. And do they also have some CCBI unique numbers as well?
Yes.
And are they 5 through 8?
Yes.
Were you asked, and so you determined that the DNA profiles from each one of those swabbings was in fact the DNA of Melissa Huggins-Jones?
That the DNA profile from each of those matched the DNA profile that was obtained from her bloodstain.
And can 2 people have the same DNA?
We haven't tested everyone in the world. We know identical twins, using the technology that I used in this case, will have the same DNA. I cannot say for absolute certainty that someone else couldn't have the same DNA, but it would not be likely based on the testing we've done so far.
Were you asked to do a second or an additional batch of testing or additional submission under the burglary, that is, as we've been talking about, the downstairs apartment?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recall when that was?
That was submitted to the laboratory on July 2nd of 2013.
And what items were you asked to examine at this time?
7 swabs that were labeled as possible DNA swabs.
Can I have that approach?
Yes.
I'm going to show you several other items. States 324, 325, 326, 327, 328, 330, and 331. Do you recognize these 7 items?
Yes, ma'am.
And what are these 7 items?
These 7 items are the second submission that I received in the burglary case, the possible DNA swabs that were sent in with a request to develop DNA profiles.
And at this point, you had said that they were possible DNA swabs. Earlier, Agent Ferran had described them as contact DNA swabs, and I believe Agent Gold earlier might have called some of her swabs touch DNA swabs. What does touch DNA or contact DNA mean?
Contact DNA or touch DNA is looking for skin cells that are transferred from the handling or touching of an item that would be passed from your hand or a portion of your body onto that item through contact.
And when I, for example, touch this desk, am I automatically going to leave DNA? Can you tell us about that?
Not automatically. Touch DNA, like I said, we don't have a screening test for it. So there's no way I can look at these swabs and say, yes, I'm going to get a profile, or no, I'm not going to get a profile from them. When touch DNA is left, there's a lot of variables that go into whether or not we will actually get a profile. If it's an item that you handle on a regular basis, like your cell phone, there's a much better chance, because you come in contact with that item on a regular basis, that I'm going to detect your DNA profile on it. If it's something that you touch once, like a doorknob walking through a door, you're not coming in contact with that item very long. So the chance of you leaving DNA behind lessens. Additionally, the type of object it is also, it plays a large portion. So if it's a rough edged item like a brick, that would grab onto your skin cells and they would come off more readily than a smooth item like this table. There's not as much there that would grab onto the skin cells to allow the transfer to happen. Those are just a couple of the reasons that it's incredibly variable what results we would get.
If a particular suspect was wearing gloves, would you anticipate that it might be more difficult or less difficult to get touch DNA?
Gloves would put a barrier between your skin and whatever you touch. It would be most likely that it would make it more difficult.
And I think Agent Gold had indicated in her testimony that perhaps if someone sweated through the gloves, maybe they would hope to get some DNA. Is that an easy thing for you to develop?
No, because you would have to not only sweat through the clothes, but your skin cells would also have to figure out how to work their way through so that they could be left behind. So that would not be something that would typically happen a lot.
And so those 7 potential, I think the way they're worded as contact DNA swabs, you had just said that there's no real screening test for those. Once you got those particular items, what, if anything, did you do with them?
Each of those items, a portion of the swab was cut off and placed into a tube, and they were individually put through the DNA process to attempt to develop a profile.
And with those particular potential swabs, what, if any, results were you able to determine?
No DNA profile was obtained from the 7 possible DNA swabs.
And so does that mean you couldn't get any profile at all?
Correct.
And to be clear, on every approach, all of those, if you could, looking at the labels again, do they appear to be collected by Agent Ferran?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were not able to just develop any DNA profile from which to compare?
No, ma'am.
Did you have any other requests for submission under the burglary case number?
No, just those 2.
Turning your attention to what you said, your agency labeled as the homicide case, when was the first, did you have multiple requests under that file number as well?
I did, yes.
And when was the first time you were asked to examine items in that case?
The first submission was on May 15th of 2013.
And what items were you given at that time?
I received a sexual assault evidence collection kit from Melissa Jones and a swabbing from the exterior deck railing and a swabbing from the master bedroom wall.
Again, the sexual assault evidence collection kit, is that the item right there in front of you?
Yes, ma'am. State's Exhibit 30.
$35 and $36, and ask if you recognize those.
Yes, ma'am.
And what are those 2 items?
State's Exhibit 35 and 36 are items I received under the homicide submission. State's Exhibit 35 is the swabbing from exterior deck railing, and State's Exhibit 36 is the envelope containing the swabbing from master bedroom wall.
And those 2 items, you said, were the first ones that you were asked to analyze. Again, what were you looking for in this particular case?
In this case, I screened for blood, semen, and saliva on items and then performed DNA analysis.
You described the process for examining for blood previously. What kind of tests do you do for saliva?
For saliva, there is also a screening test that we perform. And in this case, it was also a color change test where I add a small portion of the sample in question to a tube, add colorless chemicals, and if it's a positive reaction, it turns from a clear to a blue color which would let me say that there's an indication for saliva.
And to be clear, you got two particular swabbings. Were you asked to actually analyze the items within the kit themselves?
The items in the kit are the items that were looked at for semen and saliva.
And at the time that these were brought to you in mid-May, was there at least a concern or a desire to want to see whether or not there had been a sexual assault in this case?
The kit was collected, so as a part of our normal process, that we analyze it for the presence of body fluids that would be left behind in a sexual assault.
With respect to the items in the kit, are you familiar with, or what exactly was brought to you in the kit for analysis?
The kit contained a blood stain, vaginal...
Let me stop you. Is that what you referred to earlier as the blood stain of Melissa Huggins-Jones?
Yes, ma'am. A vaginal smear and vaginal swabs, a rectal smear and rectal swabs, an oral smear and oral swabs, pubic hair combings, a known pubic hair standard, and a known head hair standard.
And did you analyze those items for the bodily fluids that we talked about?
All except the hair items.
And with respect to looking at any of those swabs or smears, were you able to find any indication of a sexual assault? I'm sorry, any foreign DNA or anything of that nature?
The vaginal smear, rectal smear, and oral smear failed to reveal the presence of sperm, and the swabs that were contained in the sexual assault kit failed to reveal indications for semen or saliva. So
Nothing that you needed to further analyze with respect to anything that was taken in the sexual assault?
Other than her standard, yes, ma'am.
And then having the standard that you said earlier, you used the DNA analysis to develop a profile. What did you do in connection with the two items that you have in front of you, 35 and 36?
The State's Exhibits 35 and 36 both underwent the screening test for indications of blood, and they did give chemical indications for the presence of blood, and then a sample was cut from each of those for DNA.
And did you use the same process that you've described to us before?
Yes,
And were you able to develop a DNA profile from those items?
I was.
And were you able to compare that against the standard of Melissa Huggins-Jones?
I was.
And what was your opinion as to the DNA profile that you found in 35 and 36 as it relates to Ms. Huggins-Jones?
The DNA profile obtained from the swabbing from the exterior deck railing and the swabbing from the master bedroom wall was obtained that matches the DNA profile obtained from the blood stain from Ms. Jones.
And is it possible when you're doing, for example, DNA testing to have, say, a combination of contributors of DNA?
Yes.
And in this case, were there any concern that that DNA profile from either of those swabbings may be attributed to, for example, Melissa and someone else?
No, there was no indication of a mixture, which would be when more than one person's DNA is present.
And I didn't ask you about the DNA profile submitted by Agent Foran, but any mixture in any of those, or were they all matches to just Melissa Huggins-Jones?
The other items submitted in the burglary case did not appear to be a mixture either.
At some point later, were you asked to analyze an additional item in regards to the homicide case?
Yes.
And what was that item?
The second report I generated was a DNA examination on a root removed from the hair from the sexual assault evidence collection kit.
And do you recall specifically where that hair was collected or how it was identified to have been collected?
It was a part of the pubic hair combings.
And when you say you examined the root, can you explain how that, why the root is important for a DNA analysis?
The root is the portion of the hair that contains the part of DNA that we can look at in our laboratory. It can have a skin tag attached to it, which will give us a DNA profile. The remainder of the hair is not suitable for the type of DNA analysis that we do at the State Crime Laboratory.
And with respect to the hair that you had been presented, what, if anything, did you do with that root?
That root was also put through the same process to obtain a DNA profile.
And what were your results with respect to that hair, or at least its root?
That the DNA profile obtained from the root removed from the hair in the pubic hair combings is no different than that of the victim, Miss Jones.
And when you say no different, is it,
That it was consistent with her standard.
were you asked to analyze any other items in that second report or submission?
Not in the second report.
Did there come a time when you were asked to analyze some additional items under the homicide case?
Yes.
And what were those items?
I received 4 swabs from fabric impressions, 2 additional touch DNA swabs, a pair of Nike sneakers, orange and black in color, a pair of Nike sneakers, black and blue in color, a black thermal shirt, a burgundy shirt, a black shirt, another burgundy shirt, a burgundy shirt with a white logo, and a Chicago Bulls hat. Additionally, 3 standards were also submitted in that case.
In the earlier test that you did that we talked about, either in the burglary report or in the homicide report, you said that you had a known standard of Melissa Huggins-Jones. At the time that the initial items were presented to the lab, were there any suspects that the Raleigh Police Department had given you information about?
Not at that time.
And you said at this time on this submission, at this point, you had 3 additional standards.
Yes, ma'am.
When were these items submitted, or when were you requested to begin your analysis? Kind of give us a time frame.
They were submitted on July 2nd of 2013.
And did you analyze those right away?
No, ma'am. My report's dated June 4th of 2014.
So the earlier requests that were made of the Raleigh Police Department to sort of expedite, are we now in a process where they're in line with the remainder of that?
Yes, ma'am.
May I approach the witness, Judge?
Yes.
You had said that you had gotten 3 known standards. How were those standards submitted to you?
They were delivered in person. They were taken to our evidence control unit.
And were they blood stains, or I should have asked a better question, in what manner were they collected and brought to you?
Oh, they're buccal swabs or cheek swabbings. They're swabs that are rubbed on the inside of the mouth to get a known standard.
I'm going to show you 3 items, States Exhibit 70, 71, and 76, already in evidence as the buccal swabs of Sarah Redden, Travion Smith, and Ronald Anthony. And do you recognize those?
Yes,
And are those the known standards that you are now given in connection with this case?
they are.
Once you received these known standards, what did you do specifically with, we've heard that they were cheek swabs or the buccal swabs. What did you do with that?
A portion of the swabs were taken and individually placed in their own tubes, and they were put through the exact same process as all the other items to develop a genetic profile.
And so for each Miss Redden, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Anthony, did you do that?
Yes.
You received several other items. I'm going to hand you some of the smaller ones first. Actually, I hand them to you in the manner in which you got them. I'm going to hand you States Exhibit 190, which is listed as a swab from a fabric impression. Is that one of the items you received?
Yes.
States Exhibit 191, an additional swab from fabric impression, or at least that's how it reads on the outside. Is that an additional item that you received?
Yes.
States Exhibit 192, listed as a swab from a fabric impression. Did you receive that?
I did.
States Exhibit 172, which is, as it's listed, swab from daughter's bedroom doorknob. Did you receive that?
Yes.
States Exhibit 218, swab from master doorknob. Did you receive that?
I did.
States 161 listed as on this swab from fabric impression.
Yes.
That one. And then some larger items. States Exhibit 60 listed as Reacts sneakers. Did you receive those?
Yes, ma'am.
States Exhibit 57 marked as blue and black sneakers. Did you receive that?
Yes, ma'am.
Several shirts that you described. I'm gonna set these down so people can see. Did you also receive States Exhibit 53, which is first marked as a black thermal shirt?
Yes, ma'am.
States Exhibit 52 marked as a a burgundy shirt.
Yes.
Set them down. States Exhibit 51 listed as a black shirt.
I received that.
2 additional burgundy shirts. Sorry about that. States Exhibits 54 and 55, and see if you received these.
Yes.
And one last. And I am. States Exhibit 56 listed as a bull's hat.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Are those all of the items that you received here in this third submission?
Yes.
When you received all of those items, what, if anything, did you do or were asked to do with these items?
The clothing, so the 2 pairs of shoes, the various shirts, and the hat, I screened for indications of blood. All of those items failed to reveal the presence of blood, so that ended my analysis of those items.
Let me ask you a quick question. Like earlier you had said when you got a swabbing from a potential blood item, you said that you would take it and then put it on the paper to see if it changed. When you have a small item, is it easier, you take the swab and then try to do the chemical indication, is that right?
For the clothing items, after a visual examination to see if I see any staining present on the item, I then partition off the article. So if it's a shirt, normally I take the first quadrant of it. Using a piece of filter paper, generally rub the entire article of clothing to transfer any possible stains that I cannot view with my naked eye onto the filter paper, and then add the chemicals and look for a color change.
And will you do it all around the shirt or in different areas?
Depends on what I see. If I do not see visual staining, then I will check the entire article of clothing.
And so, for example, with those shirts, if you didn't see with your eye in the visual examination, would you do as best you could to look or examine the entire shirt to see whether there were any sort of chemical indications of blood?
Yes, the entire shirt would have been covered through various rubbings using different pieces of filter paper.
And as best my notes recollect, there were 3 burgundy shirts, 2 black shirts, 2 pairs of sneakers, and a hat. Did any of those items indicate to you chemically the presence of blood?
No.
And if you don't have any sort of chemical indication in that presumptive test, is there anything additional you can do with those items?
Not in this case.
You said that's what you did with the clothing. What about the other items that you received?
The swab from the fabric, the 2 swabs from the fabric impression, 3 swabs from fabric impression, and the 2 swabs labeled as touch DNA, a portion of each of those was taken for DNA analysis, as well as the 3 standards that were submitted as a part of this case.
And if you could walk us through each of those individually and what your findings were.
Yes. From 2 of the fabric impression swabs and 1 of the touch DNA swabs, no DNA profile was obtained.
And that is, you tried to do the process that you described and did not come up with the DNA profile.
Correct. From 1 of the swabs from the fabric impressions, a partial unknown male DNA profile was obtained that does not match the DNA profiles obtained from the standards from Ms. Jones, Ms. Redden, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Anthony. And from the other touch DNA swab, examination of it revealed the presence of 1 allele, which is not of sufficient quality or quantity for inclusionary purposes. I cannot render any conclusion as to the contribution of the DNA profiles obtained from Ms. Jones or Ms. Redding to this profile, and the DNA profiles obtained from Mr. Smith and Mr. Anthony were excluded as being contributors to this allele.
And what do you mean by that? There just isn't enough? Or...
No, it's a very limited amount of DNA that we obtained, that I obtained from that sample, and due to the limitation, I can't make an inclusionary statement. I cannot say that it matched someone because of the limited amount of data obtained.
But with that limited amount that you had, were you able to exclude Travion Smith and Ronald Anthony?
Yes.
And I want to take you back to the one with a partial unknown.
Go ahead and finish this train of thought, but it's 5 o'clock.
The partial unknown male, were you able to, you can tell it's a male profile and that's it?
Yes. And it did not match any of the standards I had.
All right, very good. So, ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, we'll recess for the afternoon. Resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Please recall all the instructions I've given you. Don't talk about this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Don't form or express any opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters, and no contact or communication with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. Leave your notepads. Like I say, we'll gather at 9:30 tomorrow morning in the deliberation room. I know some of you have been looking at weather forecasts for next Monday, and we will keep an eye on that and give you instructions if there is to be any delay or anything of court. We will make arrangements for you to get either a telephone message through that message line that you've used before, or we'll have Ms. Harrell contact you. So you shouldn't worry about that. We'll keep an eye on that, and hopefully it won't develop into anything significant. Thank you very much for your service. Everyone else, please remain seated. Are there any matters that we need to take up before we recess?
No, sir. No, sir.
We'll be in recess till 9:30 tomorrow morning.
Report stand in recess till 9:30 tomorrow morning.